At the reading of the will, my son shouted in front of everyone, "If that shrew gets a share, I'll give up mine." I stayed silent and smiled. He didn't know the fortune was worth $11 million. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. The lawyer, Mr. Patterson, paused, his eyes darting nervously between Wesley and me. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. I could feel the weight of everyone's stares, my daughter-in-law Diane's smug expression, my sister-in-law Barbara's pitying glance, even my grandchildren's confused faces. My hands trembled slightly in my lap, but I kept my composure, the way I always had for the past 50 years. "Please continue, Mr. Patterson," I said quietly. Wesley scoffed, leaning back in his chair. At 47, my son had grown to look remarkably like his father Frank, tall, broad-shouldered, with that same confident set to his jaw. But where Frank's confidence had been earned through decades of hard work, Wesley's came from entitlement. "Mom, let's not pretend," Wesley said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Dad built this company from nothing. You were just along for the ride." Diane nodded in agreement, her manicured hand resting possessively on Wesley's arm. "Frank always said business decisions should stay with those who understand business," she added, not even bothering to look at me. I swallowed the familiar hurt, the same pain I'd been swallowing for years. At 72, I'd grown accustomed to being dismissed, overlooked, treated as if my only contribution to our family had been birthing Wesley and supporting Frank. They never saw the nights I spent reviewing contracts when Frank was too exhausted, the client relationships I nurtured while hosting countless dinners, the careful financial decisions I guided Frank toward when his ambition outpaced his judgment. Mr. Patterson cleared his throat. "This is just a preliminary meeting," he reminded. "Everyone, the formal reading will take place next week when the full documentation is prepared." "What's there to prepare?" Wesley demanded. "Dad left the business to me, the house to Mom for her lifetime, and the rest split between us. We all know that's what he planned." I caught Mr. Patterson's eye, and something in his expression made me sit a little straighter. Frank and I had spoken privately many times in his final months, as the cancer slowly took him from us. During those quiet conversations, when medication lowered his guard, my husband had confessed many regrets, particularly about Wesley. "I indulged him too much," Frank had whispered one night, his hand gripping mine with surprising strength. "I thought I was showing him love, but I just taught him to expect everything handed to him. He'll learn," I had reassured him, though I hadn't believed it myself. Frank's eyes had been clearer that night than they'd been in weeks. "No, Mabel. Not unless something forces him to." Now, watching Wesley's entitled anger, I understood what Frank had meant. My son truly believed he deserved everything his father had built, without earning any of it. "The estate is more complex than you might think, Mr. Wesley," Mr. Patterson said carefully. "Your father made some significant changes in his final months." Wesley's head snapped up. "Changes? What changes?" I studied my folded hands, feeling a strange calm settle over me. Frank had never told me exactly what he'd planned, but he'd asked me to trust him one last time. "Wait and see, Mabel," he'd said, with that familiar twinkle in his eye that had first made me fall in love with him 50 years ago. "Just promise me you'll stand your ground when the time comes." "This is ridiculous," Wesley was saying now, standing up so abruptly his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "Whatever Dad did, I'll contest it if necessary. Mom has no head for business. She'd run the company into the ground in a month." "Wesley," I said softly, speaking up for the first time since his outburst. "Your father built Harrington Manufacturing. Over 45 years. Don't you think he had the right to decide what happened to it?" My son looked at me as if I'd suggested the earth was flat, and he decided to leave it to me, his son, his only child, the the one who's worked beside him for 20 years, not to his housewife who can barely operate a smartphone. The casual cruelty stung, but I didn't flinch. Behind Wesley's bravado, I could see something new in his eyes. Fear. He'd been counting on this inheritance, perhaps more than I realized. As everyone filed out of the room, Diane paused by my chair, leaning down as if to embrace me, her voice a poisonous whisper in my ear. "Don't get any ideas, Mabel. Wesley is prepared to fight for what's rightfully his." I patted her hand gently. "We all get what we deserve in the end, dear." When I was finally alone with Mr. Patterson, he looked at me with concerned eyes. "Are you all right, Mrs. Harrington?" I nodded, a strange lightness filling my chest. Frank knew exactly what he was doing, didn't he? Mr. Patterson's professional facade cracked into a small smile. "Your husband was a very wise man, and he adored you more than you probably realize." As I gathered my purse to leave, I thought about the fortune that Wesley had no idea existed. The $11 million Frank had quietly amassed beyond the company's value, and what my husband had decided to do with it. Next week would change everything. And for the first time in decades, I found myself looking forward to the future. The week between meetings stretched endlessly. I spent most of it alone in the house that Frank and I had shared for 43 years, running my fingers along the familiar surfaces, remembering. We'd bought this place when Wesley was 4, a modest 3-bedroom that seemed enormous after our starter apartment. Frank had just secured his first major contract, and I'd recently abandoned my teaching career to support his growing business. "Temporary," he'd promised as I packed away my education degree. "Just until things stabilize." But things never quite stabilized enough for me to return to teaching. Instead, I became Harrington Manufacturing's unseen foundation, managing our home, raising Wesley, hosting clients, reviewing contracts after hours, all while Frank became the company's public face. I paused at the mantel, picking up a photo from Wesley's college graduation. Frank stood proudly beside him, both in matching suits, their posture identically confident. I stood slightly apart, smiling, but somehow separate. Even then, I could see the pattern forming, though I'd been powerless to stop it. The doorbell rang, startling me from my memories. Barbara stood on the porch, clutching a casserole dish. "Thought you might need some company," my sister-in-law said, brushing past me into the kitchen. Unlike Frank, who'd been warm and gregarious, Barbara had always been brutally direct. "You look terrible, Mabel." I touched my uncombed hair self-consciously. "I haven't been sleeping well." Barbara set down her dish and faced me squarely. "Wesley's been calling me. Says Frank might have changed the will, might have left you more than your fair share." She made air quotes around the last words. "The reading isn't until tomorrow," I said carefully. "Cut the act, Mabel. Did Frank leave you the company?" I met her gaze steadily. "Frank and I didn't discuss the details of his will." Barbara snorted. "Right, 50 years together, and he never mentioned his plans for the multi-million-dollar company you helped him build." "Frank made his own decisions." She studied me for a long moment. "You know, I never understood you. You let Frank and Wesley walk all over you for decades. Even now, you're defending them." I turned away, busying myself with making tea. "You didn't live my life, Barbara." "No, thank God," she muttered. "I would have left Frank the first time he took credit for my work, which, from what I observed, was sometime around 1980. The kettle whistled, saving me from responding. As I poured hot water into mugs, Barbara continued, her voice softening. Slightly. "Do you remember when Wesley was about 12 and Frank got him that ridiculous racing bike?" I nodded, setting a mug in front of her. Wesley had begged for that bike for months, despite my concerns it was too advanced for him. "You told Frank it was dangerous. Frank bought it anyway. 3 weeks later, Wesley broke his arm." "That was a long time ago," I murmured. My point is, you were right. You were always right, Mabel. About Wesley, especially. You saw what Frank was creating with his indulgence. An entitled, spoiled man who never had to earn anything. I sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted. What do you want me to say, Barbara? That I failed as a mother? That I should have put my foot down more? Barbara reached across the table and gripped my hand, a rare gesture of affection from her. I want you to stop blaming yourself for Wesley's character. Frank made him what he is. Maybe you could have fought harder, but Frank would have just gone behind your back anyway. Tears pricked at my eyes. I did try, you know. When Wesley was in college, he got into trouble, drinking, failing classes. I wanted consequences. Frank just threw money at the problem, moved him to a different school. I remember, Barbara said grimly. And then Frank gave him a vice presidency straight out of college, despite him having 0 qualifications. I sighed, memories flooding back. Wesley's first year at the company, he lost a major client with his arrogance. Frank covered for him, told everyone it was a strategic decision. And now Wesley thinks he's entitled to run the company, Barbara concluded. He's worked there for 20 years, I pointed out. Worked? Barbara scoffed. He shows up late, leaves early, takes credit for his team's ideas, and spends more time on the golf course than in his office. Meanwhile, he and Diane are spending money like water. The new vacation house, the boat, private schools for the kids. I looked up sharply. How bad is it? Barbara hesitated. There are rumors, Mabel. Wesley's been leveraging his expected inheritance. They're in debt up to their eyeballs. This wasn't entirely surprising. Wesley and Diane had always lived beyond their means, and recently they'd been pressing Frank to formalize the succession plan, to put in writing what Wesley assumed was his birthright. Did Frank know? I asked quietly. Barbara nodded. Jim in accounting showed him some concerning transactions about 6 months ago. Wesley had been giving himself unauthorized bonuses, billing personal expenses to the company. 6 months ago, right around when Frank had started having those serious private conversations with me and Mr. Patterson. The timing suddenly made sense. After Barbara left, I went to Frank's study, a room I'd barely entered since his death. His presence was strongest here, in the leather chair worn to the shape of his body, the faint smell of his cologne still lingering. I ran my hand along his desk, remembering how many nights I'd brought him coffee as he worked late, how many times I'd given him my thoughts on a contract or a negotiation strategy. In the bottom drawer, I found a small leather journal I'd never seen before. Inside, in Frank's precise handwriting, was a letter addressed to me. My dearest Mabel, it began. If you're reading this, I've already gone, and you're wondering if you've spent your life being a doormat. The answer is yes and no. Yes, I took advantage of your generosity and brilliance too many times to count. No, it wasn't your fault. It was mine for being too proud to publicly acknowledge how much I needed you. The letter continued for pages. Frank's confession of how he'd realized too late the monster of entitlement he'd created in Wesley, how he'd watched our son manipulate and charm his way through life without developing any real substance. I can't undo the past, the letter concluded, but I can try to shape the future. Forgive me for the pain that's coming, but trust that it's necessary. Wesley needs to learn what you and I never taught him, that nothing valuable comes without earning. I'm trusting you to be stronger than I ever was. All my love, Frank. I closed the journal, my hands trembling. Tomorrow, I would discover exactly what Frank had planned, and why Wesley was so afraid. The morning before the final will reading, I decided to visit my grandchildren. Wesley and Diane had always controlled my access to them, scheduling our interactions, with the precision of international diplomats arranging peace talks. But today, I didn't call ahead. I simply drove to their sprawling Tudor-style home and rang the doorbell. The housekeeper, Maria, answered. her eyes widening at the sight of me. Mrs. Harrington, I didn't know you were coming today. Is Diane home? I asked, already knowing she would be at her weekly tennis lesson. No, ma'am, just the children. They're finishing breakfast. I smiled warmly. Perfect. I thought I'd surprise them. Maria hesitated, clearly uncertain whether to admit me without Diane's permission, but her respect for me as the family matriarch won out. She stepped aside. Emma and Jacob, 12 and 10, were sitting at the kitchen island, still in their pajamas despite it being nearly 10 o'clock. They looked up in surprise as I entered. Grandma? Emma said, her voice uncertain. Mom didn't say you were coming. It's a surprise visit, I explained, setting my purse down. I missed you both. Jacob, always the more affectionate of the two, slid off his stool and gave me a quick hug before retreating. Emma stayed where she was, watching me warily. Are your parents around? I asked casually, though I already knew the answer. Dad's at work, Jacob said. Mom's at tennis. I nodded, taking a seat at the island. How's school going? Emma shrugged. Fine. Did you finish that science project you were working on? The one about ecosystems? Emma's eyes widened slightly. You remember that? Of course I do, I said, gently. I remember everything you tell me. A flash of confusion crossed her face. But Mom said you don't really listen to us. That you're too distracted. My heart contracted painfully, but I kept my expression neutral. What else does your mom say about me? The children exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. You can tell me, I assured them. I won't be upset. Jacob bit his lip. She says you never really wanted Dad to be born, that you resented having to give up your job to raise him. The cruelty of the lie stole my breath for a moment. I had adored Wesley from the moment he was placed in my arms. Yes, I'd mourned my teaching career, but I'd never once regretted my son. And, Emma added hesitantly, she says you tried to convince Grandpa Frank not to let Dad work at the company because you were jealous of him. I closed my eyes briefly, steadying myself. Do you believe that? Both children looked down at their cereal bowls. It's okay, I said softly. These are complicated grown-up issues. But I want you to know that I have always loved your father very much, and I love both of you more than anything. I spent the next hour really talking with my grandchildren, perhaps, for the first time. Without Diane's hovering presence, they gradually relaxed, sharing stories about school and friends. I realized how little I actually knew about their lives, how successfully Diane had isolated them from me. As I was preparing to leave, not wanting to be there when Diane returned, Emma suddenly asked, Grandma, are you and Dad fighting about Grandpa's money? I paused, choosing my words carefully. Your grandfather worked very hard all his life. He wanted to make sure his money was used wisely. Dad says you're trying to take what belongs to him, Jacob said bluntly. A wave of sadness washed over me. Is that what he told you? Emma nodded solemnly. He was really upset. He said you never supported him like Grandpa did. I knelt down to their level, looking into their young, troubled faces. Sometimes adults disagree about important things, but that doesn't change how much we all love you. No matter what happens with Grandpa's will, you will always be my precious grandchildren. On the drive home, I could barely see through my tears. Diane hadn't just poisoned my relationship with my grandchildren, she'd rewritten our entire family history. In her version, I was the villain, the jealous mother who resented her own son's success. I pulled over, unable to continue driving. The pain was too sharp, too fresh. All these years I'd believed that Wesley's dismissive attitude toward me was simply the result of Frank's indulgence, of masculine pride. I never imagined he harbored such deep resentment, that he believed I had tried to hold him back. When I Finally arrived home, a familiar car was parked in my driveway. Thomas Reed, Frank's oldest friend and the company's financial controller, was waiting on my porch. "Thomas," I greeted him, wiping away the last traces of tears. "This is unexpected." His weathered face was grave. "We need to talk, Mabel, about Wesley." Inside, Thomas declined coffee, getting straight to the point. "Wesley's been borrowing against his inheritance, heavily." I nodded. "Barbara mentioned he and Diane have financial problems." "It's worse than that," Thomas said grimly. "He's leveraged everything on a real estate development in Colorado. Luxury ski condos. The project is failing spectacularly." "How bad?" "He's nearly $2 million in debt with nothing to show for it except half-built structures that won't pass code inspection." I sank into a chair. "Did Frank know?" Thomas nodded. "Frank discovered it about 7 months ago. Wesley had been embezzling from the company to cover his personal debts." "Embezzling?" The word felt like a physical blow. "Are you certain?" "I have the documentation." Frank confronted him privately. They worked out a repayment plan to avoid criminal charges. Frank was devastated. 7 months ago, when Frank's cancer had suddenly seemed to accelerate, when he'd started having those intense private conversations with me and Mr. Patterson. "Wesley's counting on his inheritance to bail him out," Thomas continued. "If he doesn't get what he's expecting." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Wesley wouldn't just lose face. He could lose everything. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. Thomas's expression softened. "Because Frank asked me to, after the will reading. He wanted you to understand what you're dealing with. Wesley isn't just entitled, Mabel. He's desperate." After Thomas left, I sat alone in my quiet living room, the weight of this new knowledge pressing down on me. My son, who had everything handed to him his entire life, had still wanted more. He'd stolen from his father, lied to his family, and now expected his inheritance to save him from the consequences of his actions. And tomorrow, at the will reading, he would discover whether Frank had thrown him a lifeline or cut him loose, to finally sink or swim on his own. The morning of the final will reading dawned bright and clear. I dressed carefully in a navy suit that Frank had always liked, my one concession to sentimentality. As I fastened my pearl earrings, Frank's gift, on our 40th anniversary, the doorbell rang. Mr. Patterson stood on my porch, his expression grave. "Mrs. Harrington, I thought we might ride together." I raised an eyebrow. "The reading isn't for 2 hours." "I know. I thought you might appreciate some preparation." I invited him in, a knot of anxiety forming in my stomach. "Is something wrong?" Once, seated in my living room, Mr. Patterson removed a thick folder from his briefcase. "Before we join the others, I need to explain Frank's plan in detail. He was very specific about the timing." "I'm listening," I said, folding my hands in my lap to keep them from trembling. "Frank came to me 8 months ago, shortly after his diagnosis. He was concerned about Wesley's fiscal responsibility." I nodded. "I've since learned about the embezzlement." Mr. Patterson looked relieved. "Good. That makes this easier." Frank was deeply troubled by Wesley's actions. Not just the legal implications, but what they revealed about his character. He opened the folder, revealing a series of documents. Frank restructured his estate with 2 primary goals: protecting the company's future and providing you with security and control. "Control?" I repeated, the word unfamiliar in relation to my role in the family. "Yes." Frank recognized belatedly that you were always the more prudent decision-maker. He came to believe that Wesley's sense of entitlement stemmed from Frank's own actions, always giving Wesley what he wanted, never requiring him to earn his place. I felt a strange sense of validation hearing Frank's thoughts echoed by Mr. Patterson. For decades, I'd voiced these same concerns, only to be dismissed as overprotective or lacking business acumen. The will creates a trust, Mr. Patterson continued. All of Frank's assets, the company, the properties, the investments, will be held in this trust. You, Mabel, are the primary trustee. I stared at him. Me? Not Wesley? Not Wesley, he confirmed. Frank believed you would make decisions based on what's best for the family's long-term security, not just immediate gratification. My mind raced, trying to process this reversal of the roles I'd inhabited for 50 years. Wesley will contest it, I said finally. Frank anticipated that. Mr. Patterson's expression was grim, which is why he included some unusual provisions. He pulled out another document, this one marked with several highlighted sections. If Wesley contests the will, he forfeits everything. No exceptions. Everything? My voice was barely audible. Everything. His position at the company, his inheritance, even the house they live in, which is technically owned by Harrington Manufacturing. I stood up, suddenly needing to move. This seems extreme. Frank was protecting the company. And you, Mr. Patterson said. He knew Wesley would try to bully you into giving him control. This was his way of ensuring that couldn't happen. I paced to the window, gazing out at the garden Frank and I had tended together for decades. What about my grandchildren? Emma and Jacob shouldn't suffer for their father's mistakes. Frank thought of that too. Mr. Patterson pulled out yet another document. The trust includes provisions for their education and future security, regardless of Wesley's actions. Those funds cannot be accessed by Wesley or Diane under any circumstances. Relief flooded through me. Whatever happened, my grandchildren would be protected. There's more, Mr. Patterson said. About the 11 million. I turned back to face him. Yes? It's separate from the company assets. It's money Frank set aside over the years, investments that performed exceptionally well. Wesley doesn't know this money exists. I gathered that, I said. Frank mentioned it to me only once in passing. This money is yours outright, Mr. Patterson explained. No trust, no conditions. Frank wanted you to have resources that were completely independent of the company and Wesley. I sank back into my chair, overwhelmed. Why didn't Frank tell me any of this before he died? Mr. Patterson's expression softened. He said you might have tried to talk him out of it, that you'd spent a lifetime making excuses for Wesley, trying to keep the peace. That stung, partly because it was true. I had spent decades smoothing things over, making excuses, trying to protect the fragile peace of our family. There's a letter, Mr. Patterson added, pulling a sealed envelope from the folder. Frank asked me to give this to you before the reading. My name was written on the front in Frank's bold, decisive handwriting. I took it with trembling fingers, but didn't open it. Some things were too private to share, even with Mr. Patterson. What do you think Wesley will do? I asked instead. He'll be angry, Mr. Patterson said bluntly, possibly threatening. Almost certainly he'll try to intimidate you into changing the terms. And if that doesn't work, then he'll try to contest it, despite the forfeiture clause. He'll claim you manipulated Frank during his illness, that Frank wasn't of sound mind. I felt a flare of indignation. Frank was sharp until the very end. We have extensive documentation of his mental competence, Mr. Patterson assured me. Multiple witnesses, medical evaluations. Wesley won't win a contest, but he could drag it out, make things unpleasant. I thought of my grandchildren, of the lies Diane had already told them. How much worse would it get if Wesley declared open war? What would you advise? I asked. Mr. Patterson considered the question carefully. Frank believed Wesley needed to face real consequences for once in his life, that without that, he'd never grow into the man he could be. And you? I think Frank was right, he said simply. But I also think you need to prepare yourself for the fallout. Wesley won't go quietly. I glanced at the clock. We had an hour before we needed to leave for the reading. An hour for me to decide whether I would follow through with Frank's plan or find some compromise to keep the peace as I'd done my entire life. "I'd like a few minutes alone if you don't mind," I said. After Mr. Patterson stepped outside, I opened Frank's letter with unsteady hands. His familiar handwriting blurred as tears filled my eyes. "My dearest Mabel," it began. "By now, Patterson has explained everything. You're probably wondering if I've lost my mind, putting you in this position. The truth is, I finally found it. For 50 years, you've been the backbone of this family, the quiet strength I relied on, but rarely acknowledged. Publicly, I took advantage of your generosity, your willingness to step back and let me shine. I failed Wesley even more profoundly. I gave him everything except what he truly needed: boundaries, consequences, the chance to earn his own success. Now he's a man who takes what he wants without thought for others, who believes he's entitled to the fruits of other people's labor. I can't undo the past, but I can try to shape the future. Wesley needs to learn what I never taught him, and you need to claim the authority you've earned through a lifetime of wisdom and sacrifice. It won't be easy. He'll fight, he'll rage, he'll try every manipulation he's ever learned. But Mabel, my love, you are stronger than you know. You've always been the true power in our family. It's time for everyone else to recognize it too. All my love, now and always, Frank." I folded the letter carefully, pressing it to my heart. Then I dried my tears, reapplied my lipstick, and went to tell Mr. Patterson I was ready. Frank was right. It was time to stop making excuses, time to stop smoothing things over. For Wesley's sake as much as my own, it was time to stand firm. The conference room at Patterson & Associates was filled to capacity. Wesley and Diane sat directly across from me, both dressed impeccably. Wesley in a charcoal suit that matched his stormy expression, Diane in a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Barbara sat beside me, her presence a silent show of support. Various extended family members and company executives lined the walls, their curious gazes darting between Wesley and me. Wesley leaned across the table. "You look pleased with yourself, Mom," he said quietly, his voice pitched so only I could hear. "Did you and Dad cook something up during his last days?" I met his gaze steadily. "Your father was of sound mind until the end, Wesley." His eyes narrowed. "We'll see about that." Mr. Patterson entered the room, accompanied by 2 associates, carrying stacks of documents. He nodded solemnly to the assembled group. "Thank you all for coming. We're here for the formal reading of Franklin Harrington's last will and testament. Before we begin, I want to clarify that Mr. Harrington revised his will 7 months ago, with multiple witnesses present, including his physician who attested to his mental competence." Wesley shifted in his chair, the first flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. Mr. Patterson adjusted his glasses and began reading the formal legal preamble. I barely heard the words, focusing instead on my son's face. Despite everything I'd learned, despite his cruelty and poor choices, my heart ached for what was coming. No mother wants to see her child suffer, even when that suffering is necessary. "Now to the disposition of assets," Mr. Patterson said, his voice cutting through my thoughts. "Franklin Harrington established the Harrington Family Trust, into which all company assets, properties, and investments have been placed." Wesley nodded impatiently. This much he had expected. "The trustee of this trust, with full authority over all business decisions, distributions, and management, is Mabel Eleanor Harrington." A shocked murmur rippled through the room. Wesley's face drained of color. "That's impossible," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "There must be some mistake." "There's no mistake," Mr. Patterson said firmly. "Mrs. Harrington has sole authority as trustee." Diane gripped Wesley's arm. "What about Wesley?" "He's the only child, the heir." "Wesley James Harrington," Mr. Patterson continued, will retain his position as Vice President of Operations, reporting directly to the Board of Directors, which will be chaired by Mrs. Harrington. Wesley's face had transformed from shock to fury. This is ridiculous. My mother knows nothing about running a company. Dad built that business. I worked alongside him for 20 years, and now you're telling me she's in charge? Your father's decision was quite clear, Mr. Patterson said calmly. My father was dying. Wesley snapped. He wasn't thinking clearly. Mom obviously manipulated him when he was vulnerable. I flinched at the accusation, but kept my composure. Wesley, please, no! He slammed his hand on the table. I will not let you steal what's rightfully mine. I'll contest this. I'll fight it with everything I have. Mr. Patterson cleared his throat. Before you make that decision, Mr. Harrington, you should be aware of the contest clause. The what? Wesley demanded. If any beneficiary contests this will or attempts to interfere with the administration of the trust, they forfeit all benefits, completely and irrevocably. Wesley laughed, incredulously. You're bluffing. Mr. Patterson silently passed him the relevant document. I watched as Wesley scanned it, his expression shifting from disbelief to horror. This is insane, he whispered. He's disinheriting me if I object to this. This travesty? Not disinheriting, Mr. Patterson corrected. The trust provides for your continued employment and a generous annual distribution, provided you fulfill your professional obligations satisfactorily. But yes, if you contest the will, you forfeit everything, including your position at the EU company. Wesley turned to me, his eyes blazing. You did this. You turned him against me. I shook my head sadly. No, Wesley. Your actions did that. Confusion flickered across his face. Your father knew about the embezzlement, I said quietly. He knew about the failed real estate venture, the $2 million in debt, all of it. Wesley paled further, his gaze darting around the room. Some of ye. The executives shifted uncomfortably, clearly hearing this information for the first time. That's a lie, he hissed. Thomas Reed provided him with the documentation, I continued, my voice steady despite my breaking heart. Your father protected you from criminal charges, but he couldn't ignore what it revealed about your character. Diane was looking at Wesley with growing alarm. What is she talking about? What embezzlement? Wesley ignored her, focusing his rage on me. You had no right to discuss my personal business in front of everyone. These are the people whose jobs you put at risk, I replied. The company that's been supporting your lifestyle could have faced serious repercussions from your actions. Enough, Wesley stood abruptly. I won't sit here and be lectured by a woman who's never worked a day in her life. Dad built that company. I helped it grow. You have no right to any of it, Mr. Patterson interjected. There's more to the will that you need to hear, Mr. Harrington. Wesley waved dismissively. I don't care. This is going to court. Mom can enjoy her little power trip for now, but it won't last. As he turned to leave, Mr. Patterson's next words stopped him cold. In addition to the company assets, Franklin Harrington had personal investments valued at approximately $11 million. Wesley froze, turning slowly back to the table. What did you say? $11 million in personal investments, separate from the company, Mr. Patterson repeated. Accumulated over the past 30 years. Wesley sank back into his chair, his expression unreadable. And I suppose that goes into this trust too? No, Mr. Patterson said simply. That amount is bequeathed directly to Mrs. Harrington, with no restrictions or conditions. The room fell completely silent. Wesley stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. $11 million, he said flatly. Dad left you $11 million. Outright. I nodded, maintaining my composure, even as my heart raced. He did, Wesley laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. All these years, you played the humble housewife, the supportive spouse who sacrificed everything for Dad's career, and all along, you were just waiting to take control. That's not true, I said quietly. I never wanted this, Wesley. I only wanted our family to be whole. Our family? He spat. There is no family anymore. You've seen to that. Diane, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. Wesley, don't be hasty. We need to think about this. He rounded on her. Think about what? How my mother has stolen my birthright? Think about our options, she said tensely, her eyes darting to the watching crowd. This isn't the place for this discussion. Wesley ignored her, focusing his rage on me. I'll fight this. I don't care what that contest clause says. No court will uphold this. This theft. Mr. Patterson cleared his throat. The trust also includes provisions for Emma and Jacob's education and future security. Those funds cannot be accessed by anyone but them, regardless of any contests to the will. Wesley's face contorted with fury. So you're bribing my children now? Trying to turn them against me too? No, I said firmly. Your father and I wanted to ensure their future no matter what. Their future is my responsibility, not yours, Wesley snapped. You think you can buy their loyalty with trust funds? I met his gaze steadily. This isn't about loyalty, Wesley. It's about security. It's about making sure that your children don't suffer for any financial difficulties you might face. The implication hung in the air between us. Wesley knew I knew exactly how precarious his finances were, how close he was to losing everything. This meeting is over, he said finally, standing again. Come on, Diane, we're leaving. As they stormed out, the room erupted in murmurs. I sat perfectly still, Frank's letter a reassuring weight in my pocket. The hardest part was done. Now came the aftermath. 3 months passed slowly. The initial shock of the will reading had rippled through our family and the company like a stone thrown into still water, creating waves that continued to spread outward. Wesley had consulted 5 different attorneys, all of whom told him the same thing. The will was ironclad. Frank had been methodical in documenting his mental competence, his reasons for the unusual arrangement, and Wesley's financial misdeeds. Any contest would not only fail, but would trigger the forfeiture clause, leaving Wesley with nothing. I spent those months learning about the company I now oversaw. Thomas Reed became my closest advisor, patiently explaining the business Frank and I had built together, but that I had always viewed from the sidelines. To my surprise, much of it came naturally to me. Years of listening to Frank's dinner table conversations, reviewing contracts late at night, and offering quiet suggestions had given me a foundation I hadn't realized I possessed. The company. Employees adapted to my leadership with varying degrees of acceptance. Some were openly skeptical, others cautiously supportive. I made no dramatic changes, focusing instead on steady, thoughtful management, exactly what Frank would have wanted. Wesley had been conspicuously absent from both the office and family gatherings. According to Barbara, who somehow always knew everything, he and Diane were reassessing their options, which I suspected meant they were desperately trying to figure out how to manage their crushing debt without the windfall they'd been counting on. I hadn't seen my grandchildren since. That day in their kitchen, the silence from them was the most painful part of this entire ordeal. On a crisp autumn morning, I was reviewing quarterly reports in Frank's old home office, my office now, when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting visitors. Opening the front. Daughter! I found Wesley standing on the porch, alone. He looked different. Thinner, with dark circles under his eyes and a humility in his posture that I'd never seen before. Wesley, I said, surprise making my voice catch. I wasn't expecting you. Can I come in? He asked, his tone lacking its usual confidence. I stepped aside, motioning him into the living room. He sat stiffly on the edge of the sofa, declining my offer of coffee. How are you? I asked when the silence stretched too long. He laughed hollowly. How do you think? My life is falling apart. I waited, sensing he hadn't come just to tell me that. We lost the house, he said finally. The bank foreclosed last week. Though I'd been expecting this news, hearing it still hurt. I'm sorry, Wesley. Are you? He asked, but without the venom I'd expected. It's what Dad wanted, isn't it? For me to lose everything? I shook my head. Your father wanted you to understand the value of what you had. He wanted you to become the man he knew you could be. Wesley stared at his hands. We're staying with Diane's sister for now. It's humbling, to say the least. The children? I asked, trying to keep the eagerness from my voice. They're confused, angry. They don't understand why we had to leave our house, why they had to change. Schools. Guilt twisted in my stomach. Wesley, I never wanted them to suffer. I know, he said quietly, surprising me. Diane told me about your visit, about what the kids said you told them. I tensed, unsure where this was going. You didn't trash me, he continued. You could have, but you didn't. Even after everything I said about you, I reached across the coffee table, tentatively placing my hand on his. You're my son. No matter what, that doesn't change. Wesley's eyes filled with tears, something I hadn't seen since he was a child. I've made such a mess of everything. Mom, the company, my marriage, my children's security. It's not too late to fix things, I said gently. He looked up sharply. Is that why you think I'm here? To beg for money? No, I said honestly. I think you're here because you're my son, and you're in pain. Wesley seemed to deflate, the last of his defensive anger dissipating. Diane left, he said abruptly. She's filing for divorce, says she didn't sign up for financial ruin. Despite everything Diane had done, I felt a pang of sympathy for Wesley. I'm sorry to hear that. Are you? He asked again, and this time there was genuine curiosity in his voice. After how she treated you? How she poisoned the kids against you? I'm sorry for your pain, I clarified, and for what this means for Emma and Jacob. Wesley nodded slowly. They're asking about you, you know, especially since Diane left. They want to know if the things she told them were true. Hope fluttered in my chest. And what did you tell them? The truth, he said simply. That their grandmother is a good person who loves them very much. That I've been unfair to you. Tears pricked at my eyes. I'd like to see them, if that's possible. That's partly why I'm here, Wesley admitted. They need stability right now, people they can count on. The unspoken request hung between us. They're always welcome here, I assured him. And so are you, Wesley. He nodded, eyes downcast. I don't know what happens next, Mom. I've lost almost everything. My marriage, my home, probably my job too, once the board realizes how badly I've mismanaged my department. I considered my next words carefully. Your father left the company in my control because he trusted my judgment. If I judge that you deserve another chance, a real one, would you be willing to earn it? Truly earn it this time? Wesley looked up, a flicker of his old defensiveness crossing his face. What does that mean? It means starting over, I said firmly. A lower position, reduced salary, regular oversight of your work. It means proving yourself not as Frank Harrington's son, but as an employee who brings value to the company. He was quiet for a long moment. And if I refuse? Then that's your choice, I said simply. The trust provides for Emma and Jacob regardless. You won't starve, but you won't have the life you've become accustomed to either. Wesley stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the garden where he'd played as a child. Dad really thought this through, didn't he? He did, I confirmed. He loved you, Wesley, enough to finally give you what you actually needed, not just what you wanted. Wesley turned back to me, his expression more vulnerable than I'd seen since he was a boy. "And you, Mom? After everything I've said and done, how can you still be willing to help me?" I rose and joined him by the window. "Because I'm your mother, and because I believe people can change when they have to." "Even someone as selfish as me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Especially you," I said, touching his cheek gently. "Because underneath everything, you're still the boy who cried when his pet goldfish died, who gave his allowance to a homeless man when you were 10, who held your newborn daughter like she was made of glass." Tears slid down Wesley's face. "I don't deserve another chance." "Maybe not," I agreed. "But you're getting one anyway. What you do with it is up to you." 2 weeks later, Wesley moved into the guest house with Emma and Jacob. He started work in the purchasing department, a significant step down from his vice presidency, but a position where he could learn the business from the ground up, the way he should have decades ago. The transition wasn't easy. There were days when Wesley's old entitlement flared up, when he bristled at taking direction from people who had once been his subordinates. But slowly, incrementally, he began to change. The real joy came from having my grandchildren nearby. Emma and Jacob spent afternoons with me after school, gradually letting go of the false narrative Diane had created. We baked cookies, planted flowers in the garden, and talked, really talked, about their lives, their feelings, their fears, about the future. "Grandma," Emma asked one evening as we prepared dinner together, "are you and Dad going to be okay now?" I looked through the window to where Wesley was helping Jacob with his science project, his face intent and patient in a way I'd rarely seen before. "I think we're going to be just fine," I told her, and for the first time in decades, I truly believed it. Frank had been right all along. Sometimes love means setting difficult boundaries, even when it breaks your heart to do so. Wesley was finally growing into the man he could be, responsible, thoughtful, earning his place in the world, rather than expecting it handed to him. As for me, at 72, I had discovered a strength I'd always possessed but rarely used. The company was thriving under my leadership, my family was healing, and I had finally found my voice after decades of silence. Frank's last gift hadn't been the money or the company. It had been the chance for all of us to become who we truly could be, once freed from the patterns that had held us back for so long. In the silence of his final plan had come our redemption. Wesley's, mine, and even Frank's, a family legacy worth far more than $11 million. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.